because she died giving birth to Mary Shelley. So Mary Shelley, and we'll talk a little bit about Frankenstein to be sure. I won't pretend to touch it all, but Mary Shelley was truly what we might say a child of intellectual nobility. Not to suggest a political thing that was normally accorded to nobility. Again, these two individuals were way ahead of their time. They were deemed radicals, and they were monitored. So, Godwin was a significant influence in many ways with his more philosophical musings, and influenced a great many of these figures that you see written on the board. I'm going to start with the exception, and that's William Blake. William Blake is an amazing poet by any stretch. You probably do know him, at least you may not remember, but you probably do know him because he happens to be the author of the most frequently anthologized poem in the English language, which is Tiger, Tiger in the Night. And so Blake was another radical who more or less developed his own mythology. It can be very complex until you familiarize yourself with it. And he's also what I would call a radical Christian. I mean, he was at odds with the church, the formal official church, but he also was profoundly into biblical text. And so he really created his own universe and peopled it with characters with interesting and abstruse names. And the other thing that is amazing is that he was not simply a poet, but also an artist. And so all of his poems of import, the vast majority of his work, is not simply words on a page, but rather words surrounded by designs placed in meaningful places. And so to give just an easy example, how many of you know Tiger, Tiger? Now, Coop's going to remedy that, I believe, down the road. If you read the poem, and just glancing at first impression, you might think, tiger, ferocious. And then you look at Blake's illustration, and it looks like a putty cat. And so there's interplay between the illustrations that he provides and the words on the page. And so he really adds a whole new dimension to his poetry through the illustrations that he provided for his work. There's a story that many historians claim is not apocryphal. I don't know what to make of it, but one time one of Blake's friends, and who was an occasional publisher of his very early work before Blake just undertook all of this business of creating books unto himself, came to visit the Blakes, and he got close to their home and got near a little gate in the fence, and he noticed that they were out in the yard, Blake and his wife, reading the Bible, naked. Adam and Eve. So you can imagine Blake was an unusual guy. It takes a while, and once you move past the Songs of Innocence and Experience, which is probably his best known work, but doesn't really prepare us for the epic poems that would follow. And it takes a while to get the flavor, but he's definitely of this era and an important guy, no doubt. So I should suggest he's sort of the exception because he really lived apart from most of these other poets, not geographically speaking, but in terms of his fiery intellect. I would also suggest he is the most radical of all the British poets, no doubt. And he too had people watching him carefully. So we talked a little bit about Godwin and Wollstonecraft. The other two people that are really significant are where we're going to be spending most of our time today, and that is Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. They are probably the best known of the British poets, especially at least of this first generation. And I think that I'll just speak towards them a little more fully once we get to the poems themselves, and so I'll leave that for now. But I do want to introduce the second generation. And here we have who I affectionately call the Mad Bad Lord Byron, who was quite a spectacle. He had a fair bit of wealth, and he was known to, and he had a limp, and he was known to walk his peacocks limping around in his yard. So just kind of think of that image, walking your peacocks on a leash. Yeah. He also was probably the most ironic amongst all of the poets. Many of his poems have a pretty profound satirical edge that cuts pretty sharply if you know how to read into it. And he was also important for a work that you will be reading that I'll talk about really soon. John Keats was he's sort of like the perfect emblem of the tragic romantic poet, because he had a very short life, cut short by what today we probably would term tuberculosis, and he didn't even see 30. But he wrote a great many wonderful poems, and was certainly well worth your attention if you choose to get a little deeper in the Romantic movement. Also, side note, his letters are also fascinating, works of art in their own right. And so that's another side of Keats that I would draw to your attention. Well, I know you know these last two names, even if you haven't read them. And they too belong in this generation. And Percy Shelley was probably the most radical of this generation. He was proudly an atheist, and yet he, in his poetry, that did not prevent him from forging his own sense of the sacred. There's a certain Platonic element in his poetry. And of course, rather famously, he was married to Mary Shelley. Now what you need to know, and Shelley did grow more conservative in her older age, but in the era we're speaking of, I think that you can imagine she wouldn't have been able to elope with Percy Shelley if she didn't feel a powerful sense of congenial kinship. And so Mary Shelley startled and outraged her father, Godwin, by eloping, and they went on a European tour and the like. Shelley himself would tragically drown in a boating accident, again before he reached 30, and so that left Mary Shelley on her own. It was while they were one of their visits to the continent that they visited this rather nice chateau in present-day Switzerland, right on Lake Geneva, hosted by Lord Byron. And the weather was not congenial. And so they decided they needed to pass some time. And so someone came up with the idea that they'd have a writing competition. And people dutifully sat down and did their bit. And it was Mary Shelley's work that carried the day. So I guess partly then what I'm trying to suggest is most of these people knew each other well, were aware of each other's work. The one exception would probably be Blake, who is less well known, but the most eccentric of any of them. Walking Peacocks with Byron, that's nothing compared to Blake's eccentricity. But nonetheless, this is sort of the central body of British Romantic poets of the era. What I want to do now is try to unpack these points a little bit. And yes?
Could you let these guys know how Mary Shelley is familiar with Coleridge?
Bring it on.
His visitation to her parents' salon.
There is a biographical story, and again, it doesn't seem to be apocryphal. As I mentioned, Mr. Godwin would frequently have visitors who came to talk about his work on inquiry into political justice and to hear him hold forth. And it's a very touching little story here. Of course, Mary